we've been tracking, at Renewables 100 Policy Institute, we've been tracking 100% renewable energy targets and projects around the world for quite a number of years now. And one of the earliest adopters all over the world, not just in the United States, not just here in California, but in Europe and in other continents as well, Australia. The first adopters, the first movers, nearly universally have been the local leaders. And people will ask me, why is that? Because they have agility, because their elected officials have to actually see their constituents at school. I think that's a reason. But it's definitely been a phenomenon. And since about 2015, thanks to, in part to economics, but in part to more leaders waking up, a ground momentum, the effort of some other NGOs who've had amazing campaigns, some of whom are in this room today, we've been seeing, we can't even track how many there are, and we always tried to be very, intellectually serious about how many have official commitments to go 100% renewable in at least one sector. It's been harder and harder to keep up because it's just been skyrocketing. And the people who are on the stage today, we have people from a couple of cities and counties that have been some of the first early movers and have had a lot of experience and have reached a maturity that they really have an important story to tell and to learn from. And we also have environmental justice leadership represented here, which is also a very important part of the picture, because we can't all go forward in a good way unless all boats are rising together. And we have the very good fortune to have as our moderator Liz Doris from National Renewable Energy Laboratory, who has been, we got in a conversation when we met last summer and it was just like fire, like, oh yes, we need to be talking about these tough questions. Now that we're getting all these commitments, that's wonderful, but what do we do and how do we integrate it? So I'm very excited to hear what these folks have to say. This is a cutting-edge conversation that is really an important part of the overall energy transition that we're talking about at this conference. So without further ado, I'm sure we'll get more people coming in over the next few minutes. Liz Doris, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It is a real honor to be here with you all, especially at this stage in the afternoon when you are ready to talk about hitting the ground running, and by running I mean running to happy hour after the final keynote. So it's really clear at 100% Renewable Conference why an organization like NREL would be here. We are focused, we're one of the 17, like Lawrence Berkeley, we're one of the 17 national labs in the Department of Energy's system, and we are exclusively focused on efficiency and renewables and integration of those technologies into the grid. And so I think a lot of some of the work, and we're really honored that some of the work has been mentioned today that we've been doing over the last 40 years since we were initiated. And so it's really clear why we're here from that technology perspective. What's less clear is why a scientist from NREL would be sitting up here moderating a communities panel, and why in fact NREL would have a position on states, localities, and tribes, and sort of governments and integration of renewable energies at that level. And the reason that we do that is because we recognize that the technology is amazing, and we are amazing as a country. We have invested in these clean tech technologies, and it is great, but when it actually gets implemented, it's on the ground. And so I often talk about renewable energy and clean energy integration as the Ginger Rogers of the energy industry, right? So Fred Astaire is the technology, and being the technology is very, very, very difficult. And the communities, though, have to take that technology and use it in environments that are highly competitive, right? Diane mentioned it with, you got to see these people at drop-off. Like, this is not going to be easy. You got to fight with them when the ref makes a bad call at baseball. So you better be, nobody does that? Nobody fights with the ref anymore? Come on. I guess we're in California. In Colorado, we fight with the ref all the time. Sorry, it's true. When we talk about communities and integrating complex technologies into complex systems environments, we really have to think about everything from jobs to how the technology will perform to how it competes with filling potholes and things like that. So I really liken it to, if you watch the old NBC show, for anybody who still watches networks like I do, if you watch the old NBC show Parks and Rec that parodies community meetings, if you've ever actually been to or chaired a community meeting, you know that that's not a parody. Like that's just like they're just filming them live, and so it's really local life. So you have to be really, really hardcore to be a public servant, and that is why I am really honored to have this conversation with this panel of people. You have their bios in your book, so I'm just going to introduce them by names and their current positions, and I think it will be clear that no one gets to these three people's positions without a tremendously huge pedigree and background of hard work. So with that, we have Deborah Raphael, who's the director of the San Francisco Office of the Environment. And we have Strela Cervas, who is the statewide program, I'm going to get it wrong, I'm so sorry, Strela, the statewide organizing director of the California Environmental Justice Alliance. And last we have the Honorable Kate Sears from Marin County, Supervisor from Marin County. So when we talked about the structure of this panel, we talked about there's so many things, right? Communities are so complex. There's so many things we could talk about, and we knew that everybody would be kind of almost done. And we wanted to focus on things that we thought were really important. So we picked three things, and we're going to talk about them. And those three things are, if I can find them in my notes, they are local government policies, and in particular, thinking about economic development. We've talked a lot about jobs and economic development today, so this will fit into that conversation. And then slightly more broadly, we wanted to talk about capacity building at the, within communities at the individual and community level, and then also on behavior change, which is where we really see the horizon of this transition sort of heading to, so sort of the future-looking piece. So the way we're going to structure it is I have a couple questions to get the panel started off, and then we're going to try to give everybody 15 minutes. So stack up those questions, or if you're feeling especially passionate, jump up and shout it. That's also fine. Yes. You can have my drink ticket if you do that. I don't think we have drink tickets, but you could have it. All right, so Debbie. San Francisco is just the most recent city in which you've been a part of this, and we're sort of wondering if you could talk to us about some of the policies that you all have seen as successful in sort of co-developing clean energy and jobs.
Great, thank you, and thank you all for sticking it out till the end of a long day of a lot of wonderful information from phenomenally smart people. So I think today's panel right now is really a chance to take a deep breath and relax from all of that, and we'll talk about some of our experiences. A city like San Francisco has a comfort level with bold goals. We love to be the first, we love to be the most bold, and so we put out there 100% renewable energy. We did it before we really knew how we were going to do it, but we find that if you set that goal, it definitely gets you in the path to ask, so how are we going to do it? The challenge being in the public sector on that is you can't make people do what you want them to do. You really have to bring them along with you. And when we talk about jobs and this clean energy economy, I find that we have to be intellectually honest. So the LAFCO was a county agency that looked at the feasibility of our CCA, our community choice aggregation, and one of my colleagues from the LAFCO is here. No, where? Back? There we go. And when the jobs report came out on how many jobs would we create by adopting this policy, it was pretty optimistic. There were, several thousand jobs that could be created. But when you looked at that scenario, almost all of them were outside of San Francisco. And when you want to get your population on board and on point with supporting policies, they have to see, what does it do for me here? And the beautiful thing about being in local government is we get to make that nexus between policy and signals to the marketplace very quickly. So when San Francisco adopted a policy of, for example, that all new construction had to have solar roof on a roof or a green roof, or that all new construction has to have electric vehicle charging capacity for 100% of the spaces, or when we say you're going to have to energy benchmark and audit buildings, that is sending signals to the marketplace immediately. What then we have to do as policymakers is make sure that the jobs that support those policies are available to all of our residents. And that's the part that sometimes slips by. And so it's very important, it was very exciting to me. So for example, on our electric vehicle policies, where we're going to shift our fleet to 100% electric, and we're going to mandate EV charging in all new construction, that the opportunity to be the mechanics for those electric vehicles are opportunities that are available to all San Franciscans. And our community college stepped up and said, we're going to double the size of our training program for EV mechanics, and we're going to train all the city mechanics on how to transition away from internal combustion engines to electric engines. Because we were leaving behind existing mechanics as well if we didn't pay attention to that. And I know that Tesla has a wonderful program. Tomorrow is one of their training programs for mechanics in this space. So there is an understanding that we need to make sure these jobs are for everyone. In terms of our energy benchmarking ordinance, we put in there a mandatory audit for all commercial buildings. The problem was we couldn't on-ramp that audit very quickly because we didn't have the workforce to support it. We needed enough auditors who were certified to be able to meet the specifications in the ordinance. So by creating policies, we send the signal to the market, we time it so that we give the market a chance to respond, and then we can create opportunities for clean energy jobs to support energy efficiency, to support clean transportation. And finally, I just want to mention something that I don't have a solution for, but I see it as a problem. I know it's come up earlier today, but this is idea of transitioning away from what I would call the fossil fuel industry to the clean energy industry. So if we've got pipe fitters who have great union jobs, and our goal is to get rid of natural gas in the building sector, so we're going to electrify everything, all of a sudden those good union jobs need to find their way into other good union jobs. And this was a real challenge for us when we were putting our CCA into practice. How are we going to make sure that we don't downgrade jobs from the status quo? So I would just encourage and challenge all of us in the room as we look at pathways to 100% renewable, that it's pathways to a good job, a good living wage, and a way to support people so that they aren't losing things in this transition.
Kate, how does that play out for you in the county?
Yeah, thanks very much. I want to follow up on that. So I'm wearing a couple of hats here today, and one of them is as a Marin County Supervisor, and another of my hats is the chair of what is now known as MCE Clean Energy. That was the first CCA created in California, then known as Marin Clean Energy. And so there's really, wearing those two hats, there are a number of different ways to really come at the job creation issue. And with MCE, with Marin Clean Energy, and now MC Clean Energy, one of our strong commitments as an agency and as a board was to make sure that we were creating jobs. And we initially focused on job creation initiatives statewide because we very much saw ourselves as a market mover and as a developer of more renewable energy capacity throughout the state of California, knowing as new installations, renewable energy generation installations were being created, that was going to create jobs. So that's where we started, looking at sort of the statewide impact. But it was also very important to us as we developed. We began serving customers in 2010. And as we developed to really create more renewable energy generation capacity in our service territory. And we have grown from Marin County. We initially expanded into Richmond, and then a number of other communities in the East Bay, and we're now expanding into Contra Costa County. So we are doubling our size by 100% right now. And we just recently, I hope many of you are aware of the 10 megawatt solar generation facility that we opened on the Chevron site in Richmond. And that's the largest local renewable energy generation site in the entire Bay Area. That created 341 jobs right there. And we required, as part of the jobs, that 50% of those jobs were people who lived in the neighborhood. And so we have very carefully built in collaboration with the unions to make sure that they are good jobs, local hire requirements, and really expanding to the extent that we can local generation so that we're creating jobs. You know, as back with my county hat on for a minute, you know, we create ordinances. We have green building ordinances that we hope stimulate jobs. We have done a similar thing of creating, and we recently amended our green building ordinances so we have expanded EV capacity requirements for any kind of major remodeling. And so we're hoping that that stimulates jobs, but also job training. And one thing that we've done, both as a county, but also through MCE Clean Energy, is to allocate funds for training in local jurisdictions for residents so that they can develop the capacity to work in the green energy sector. As a county, we work with our local schools to make sure that they are actually developing the kinds of education and training programs that we need to have. I also, as a county supervisor, sit on a lot of other boards and commissions. So in the transportation sector, Golden Gate Bridge District, Marin Transit, and the Sonoma-Marin Rail Transit Authority, the Smart Train Board. All of those transit agencies, of course, have an impact on jobs and are opportunities to really try to push forward clean transportation, both greening the fleet of those organizations, but also making sure that we're creating jobs in all those venues. So as a public elected official, there's all these opportunities to try to push wherever you are, whichever hat you're wearing, to make sure that we are attuned to good quality jobs and training so that our folks have jobs going forward, both in the present and in our century to come.
Do you want to talk a little bit, Strela, in your response about some of the rural aspects of this? I know you work in both urban and rural areas, but since you're our representative.
Yes, absolutely, happy to. And so for folks that don't know who the California Environmental Justice Alliance is, we're a statewide coalition of 10 EJ organizations that include organizations from the urban areas, rural areas in the Central Valley in particular, and then what we call sub-rural areas, which I guess the Inland Valley would be considered sub-rural. And before I get there, I did want to just take a little bit of a step back when we think about policy making to talk about values. When we first engaged in the energy world, the environmental justice community was a big unknown in the capital, in Sacramento, and in the state. And our role was really to come in and make big headway and to take a stand, because it was in our communities that all of the dirty energy infrastructure was being cited. I work in the Southeast LA area, Vernon, Huntington Park, Southgate, that area, and then also in the Wilmington area. And that community, those communities are riddled with dirty natural gas power plants and oil refineries, as well as so many other environmental justice communities. So we are really in this because people are really, there's a high stakes here. And it's not just about the technology, but really how can you think about energy, but putting equity at the center of that and putting people at the center of that, right? So when I think about jobs in the economy in the energy sector, the values that come up for us are, we talk about this concept of just transition, and I was having a great conversation with my friend Isaac over lunch about this concept of, has anybody heard about just transition at all? Yes? No? Okay, so just transition is, so in this clean energy economy, when we think about the transition from the fossil fuel infrastructure and economy into a clean energy economy, you can't just like zoom right into it, right? Because that means, you know, who are the winners and losers in that? You're thinking about the oil industry and who are the workers in the oil industry, and who are the workers in the natural gas industry, the power plant industry. It's actually our own families, it's our own neighbors, and it's actually Black and brown community members that we care about. So when we think about the just transition, we have to think about that our communities actually align really well with labor and with unions, and that we actually do want the same kinds of union jobs. We want the high wages, we want the career pathways, and we want the health benefits, and you can't just do that, you know, instantaneously. And so we have to be very thoughtful about that. So how do you apply a just transition then? What does that tangibly mean in policy? And it's taken us, you know, years to think about this, and you know, there's no sort of perfect solution around it. But what we are trying to do is bake things into policy like local hire, but not just, you know, local hire, but in which communities. So if you overlay local hire with a disadvantaged community identification marker, you're really pulling from the communities that are most impacted by the fossil fuel industry. And we've been able to be leaders in passing some of the most aggressive and forward-thinking policies in California and the nation around energy policies and really putting equity at the center. So we've had impact in the SB 350 legislation, but we've also been able to pass legislation AB 693, which was authored by Assemblymember Eggman, which is the nation's largest investment of solar on multifamily affordable housing in disadvantaged communities. It invests $1 billion over 10 years, so $100 million. And it's specifically a sole program for disadvantaged communities. And there's some local hire and really great, fantastic jobs language in there. And then I would also reference, talking about SB 350, if folks have not yet read the SB 350 Barriers Report, there's some really great recommendations around jobs and economic investments and how to address jobs in the economies, particularly in disadvantaged communities. Speaking on the rural versus urban, so I think when you think about jobs and the economy, you have to really think about what is the landscape between the rural and the urban communities. And so, for example, in LA, where I am, again, we're talking about communities that have been historically disinvested in. They have the highest rates of unemployment and underemployment. And then you've got community members that are also working in the natural gas industry. That's the landscape, at least in the communities that we work in. And then in the rural side, we have a couple member organizations in the Central Valley where they have built this gorgeous community farm, and they are employing some people in this community farm. But guess what you've got next to it? You've got this big, massive fracking infrastructure right next to it, and all the jobs are going to that fracking infrastructure, and the jobs are coming from outside of that community. So when we think about the landscape, you know, how do we effectively address putting jobs in these communities given these particular conditions, and then also thinking about long-term career pathways. And so those are the types of things that we're constantly grappling with and slowly trying to address those issues through creative policy.
I'm just a conversation person, and I want to follow up on that a little bit. So, talking on a much smaller scale than Strela works on with your geography, but you know, Marin County, we have an agricultural sector in Marin County that's a very strong sector, and so that sector has created opportunities for us to create jobs on a small scale with carbon sequestration and also with biodigesters. And the carbon sequestration was started out with the Marin County Carbon Project that's now being scaled up to agricultural communities throughout the state of California. Our biodigesters are really on a much smaller scale, but we've been working with the Air District to try to get funding so we can really scale that up. These are not hundreds and hundreds of jobs, but they're very important jobs because the impact of those activities on our county, I think, is significant in terms of carbon sequestration, obviously, but really in terms of moving forward in our goals to become a fossil-free county, but also creating the kind of work for our workers who are mostly Hispanic in West Marin that really can make a significant impact on our clean economy, but also be demonstration projects for people about how to move forward and how to contribute and create jobs for folks who have been in a traditional dairy industry, but are now really serving the green economy and in a different way.
Yeah, and I would say, I'm going to do it. I would say that nationally we see a lot of the sort of distinction between the kinds of jobs that we're talking about. There is a little bit more transferability in urban environments. There are a few more options, and so the value of those jobs in the rural areas to those communities is really, really high. And so we're seeing a lot of emphasis on, the 1 to 2 or the 5 to 10 jobs in those rural communities with our rural Americans and our native tribes. So I think it's a really interesting area that deserves a lot of our focus when we talk about transition. So I'm going to stick with you, Strela, and switch to beyond just policies, and as a policy person, it pains me to say that, but beyond just policies, there are a whole other suite of programs that are necessary to kind of help support this transition to high penetration efficiency and renewables, and we really wanted to spend a little time talking about how people go about building capacity in these communities and for individuals, and so Strela was going to talk a little bit about that through her work.
Yeah, so capacity building and leadership development is something that, is very much at the heart and soul of what CEJA does. We feel like you can't really do energy policy making without doing the really hard work of capacity building and engaging community. So I think that policy and community engagement really go hand in hand. We have, over the years, have a model about how to look at policy and sort of translate these really wonky policy concepts into community speak. So when we first started in this, we were launching our first attempt at a policy called Solar for All, which ended up actually being our AB 693 solar win on multifamily affordable housing. But it was a feed-in tariff model, and we were looking at the difference between feed-in tariff and net metering, and I know that there are some people that really hate on feed-in tariff, but we won't go there. We were having to explain these concepts to community folks. It's not, and these folks are really expert at their own community and what they need and what their vision is. But drilling down on the technical components around it was something that we had to be really creative about. And it couldn't just be a PowerPoint presentation in these communities. And so what we do is we take a lot of the concepts and we turn them into curriculum that is very much hands-on. And so we do things like we use Legos and we use shoeboxes and we use string to emulate or to mimic what a community looks like, and then the long transmission lines, and then you've got your power plant, and you've got your substation, all that stuff. And so we talk about then what does the dirty energy economy look like, and then what is your vision for what a clean energy economy can actually be. And so it's not, the concepts are not really coming from us, but it's really coming from them. A lot of our capacity building, has to be culturally appropriate. It has to be multilingual. Sometimes we do our workshops in 5 different languages. Some of our member organizations even more. There's a lot of sort of organizing and consideration for what happens when you take a policy concept and do some capacity building around it. And the messenger actually really matters. You can't just have a public agency or a utility company come in and send their community liaison and give a workshop, because there's a lot of resistance in the community. There's a lot of cynicism in the community. People are constantly knocking on their doors trying to sell them stuff, and so there's a lot of trust issues that have to be built. And so we really encourage policymakers, agencies, and our allies to really work with community-based organizations that are on the ground, such as some of the member organizations that are part of CEJA, to work with us, because we really do have a relationship, a long-standing, deep relationship that we've built over the years with these community folks. Lastly, I'll just talk about how we went from our initial Solar for All win to winning on AB 693 over a number of years. When we first started again at lobbying in the Capitol, we were really unknown, and it was a woman-led initiative, and it was a woman of color initiative. And this was our first attempt of going out legislation, and people were looking at us like, who are you and why should we care? And then our legislation went way farther than we thought. It went to close to the end of the final vote before it got to the governor, and then the utilities came in very quickly and then sent in their big lobbyists and killed the bill. But we learned, and we cried about it, and we learned a lot from that. But the way that we were able to train up our women was through a very intense and intentional process. We enrolled women in a fabulous program called the Women's Policy Institute, which is sponsored by the Women's Foundation. It's a really rare project that's in California that I think is being replicated across the nation. And so now, who's at the table in Sacramento used to be, when I was in the room, there was nobody that looked like me. You got a bunch of guys in suits, and I was the only woman of color that was young there. And now you've got a lot of women leaders of color that are in Sacramento, rubbing elbows and making policy. And so it's those sort of like tangible things that you have to do to build capacity to engage in the space.
Yeah, and following up on that, I mean, a lot of this, I think, is a matter of intentionality, and I think the social equity piece and the importance of social equity to capacity building is becoming a strong theme, both on the mitigation and the adaptation side of dealing with climate change. So a couple of examples of things that we've done as a CCA. Through MCE, Clean Energy, when we expanded into our East Bay communities, and one of our best community team members is sitting up at this table right here. I want you to stand up and wave around. This is the expert on how to do capacity building, because what our team did each time they went into a new community was to assemble a group of representatives from community organizations and key stakeholders, and that group became the driver of how do you roll out a CCA into a new community. What do we need to do? Who should we be talking to? What's important to this community? What matters to you? And so from the very beginning, that kind of capacity building, but really taking advantage of extraordinary grassroots organizations that already existed in our communities and being mindful of what they contribute, was really baked into our system. This January, Cal CCA, the existing CCAs, 12 of them now, have an organization called Cal CCA. So Cal CCA got together with the Greenlining Institute and did a program on the first Supplier Diversity Symposium that really got together stakeholders from the industry to try to share best practices for creating diversity in the energy workplace, and having a broad-ranging conversation about how do we take the expertise, much of it in this room, take ourselves as an example, and really make sure that we are all thinking about diversifying our own workplaces and diversifying everything that we're doing in the energy sector. And that was a fantastic conversation to get people really focused on diversity issues. And I want to give you one more example that's on the adaptation side of addressing climate change. Many of you may have heard about Resilience by Design, which has created teams around 12 teams around the Bay Area to really come up with innovative ideas about how to address sea level rise in particular in our communities. Well, one of the teams that has come into Marin City, a disadvantaged community in my district in southern Marin, is focusing on permaculture and social equity. And that team is extraordinarily experienced in capacity building and community organizing in a number of our East Bay communities. And they're bringing that process into Marin City and have gotten 35 members of the community to come out for a 12-week-long program to learn about permaculture, but more importantly, to really create their own people's plan for what they want to see for that community. So I'm tremendously excited about this. I think a lot of times you get great groups of experts coming in, they've got innovative ideas and they just want to tell you about it. And this group is really coming in to both educate and mobilize and listen to and help the community create its own plan. And I think it's going to be a model of how we can integrate a lot of adaptation work with community capacity building.
I'm going to change a little bit about the capacity building. I could talk also about leadership development, but I'm going to share with you some journey that we've been going on in the last year. A lot of public agencies across California now are participating in something called GARE, which is an equity training program to help institutions practice what Governor Brown calls radical curiosity, where we really look at our own functions and ask, what are the barriers to participation that are resulting in, and I'm going to use a strong word here, but I'm coming to understand it better, institutional racism. So I want to give you 3 examples of things that we discovered in our department when we started looking at who was participating in our clean energy economy programs and why weren't they participating. And was it because of something in the system that was standing in the way? So here's 3 examples where we discovered when we practiced radical curiosity some pretty important problems. So the first was we did a deep solar installation project where we worked with Grid Alternatives, we worked with our San Francisco PUC, with Go Solar SF to fund solar installation in low-income housing, mostly single family. We had members of the community, we had the right messengers, we did it in language, we did it at the right time, we offered food, we offered childcare. We had tremendous participation and curiosity about the program. We had very low uptake. So why was that? What was the missing barrier? Well, the problem is that the roofs on those houses were not capable of having solar on them. And we were not offering anything to help people put solar on an old roof. So we ended up working with our mayor's office of housing to find another pot of money to have roof repair be a part of it, and all of a sudden uptake went huge through the ceiling. There's a pun. Another example. We work very closely with PG&E as a partner to get energy efficiency into small businesses. We work very closely with small business community, especially in the Mission District, where English is not the first language. And what we found there is, even though there's all these incentives for them, often the barrier is the copay, that they can't put up the couple $1,000s that would then pay off with an ROI within a year, but they didn't have the cash. So PG&E said, great, we'll help, we'll have on-bill financing. Well, the problem with that is it's a $5,000 minimum. So that was an institutional barrier for uptake in just exactly the community you want to serve. So instead, we created a revolving loan fund with $40,000 that is another zero interest loan that can go from $500 or however much somebody wants to help get them into the program. A third example. We have all sorts of contractors who will come with incentive money to do energy efficiency upgrades in our small businesses. But they came into a business and what they saw was the equipment was so poorly maintained that they were afraid if they touched it, put in a new pump or a new lighting system, that something would break. They would be accountable for that, and they didn't want to come anywhere near it. So there was this, again, institutional barrier because of the way the program was designed that prevented people from taking advantage of it. So we had to then create a program of a maintenance training program where we handheld people to understand how to maintain their equipment so that they could become available, they could participate. So when we talk about capacity building, it's capacity in leadership, it's also capacity in participation. And often in government, we have all these barriers to participation that are part of the system. And so now I understand a little bit more when people say to me, we want to participate, we're there, but we can't. The system is stacked against us. So I think this idea of capacity building, of being sensitive to people's limitations, is crucial if we're truly going to have a pathway to 100% renewables, which is what we say we want in this room.
Liz, can I jump in there too? Because I think there's a different take on capacity building as well. And that's really capacity building within our own organizations. And certainly looking at our county as an organization, we've had capacity building work to do ourselves. We've had work to do to really break down our barriers between our silos, between our different departments, get our Department of Public Works collaborating with our planners, collaborating with our Parks and Open Space teams, and really making sure that everyone who works at our county is thinking about 100% renewable goals, is thinking about a lot of our other energy efficiency goals, is really mindful of what we want to accomplish through our climate action plan and everything that they're doing. And that's an internal capacity building process. There's also capacity building needs at our local cities and towns and our smaller jurisdictions who may not have staff to really be able to do the work that they need to do to try to implement policies that they want to have and hit goals that they want to have, they want to reach themselves. And so part of what we think of with some of the expertise that we have at the county is how do we make sure that we lend that expertise and we make it available, and we know that other jurisdictions know that they can come get assistance where they need it. So that we're really building capacity everywhere in all of our different organizations, and not only in what we traditionally think of as underserved communities.
You know, a lot of the experience that I had with capacity building early on was this sort of discomfort sometimes that technologists have, well-meaning discomfort, but sort of this, oh, well, we'll just come up with a simpler technology, and then I won't have to deal with the messy stuff, and maybe, talk to all these people. We have to go get all these people, and I think what I'm really seeing, particularly in rural America right now, is this flip of actually, if you can get to the right people, what you end up with is a very powerful network that is already existing that can help make these changes and help, if you can give them the right tools and help understand what their community needs and provide that, you can really trigger a lot of this transformation. So I've seen this real change in we'll use technology to solve the problem, which we definitely need, but also sort of embedding those communities as allies. So I think it's really amazing. Really quickly, because we want to leave a little bit of time for questions, and we're down to 11 minutes. I did want to talk a little bit about behavior change, and I think I'm just going to kick it right over to you, Kate, to talk a little bit about Drawdown.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. So I tend to be sort of an impatient person, and I feel that we're never moving as fast as we should be moving. And I was glad to hear Susan Kennedy say in an earlier panel that she thought we could get to 100% renewable energy in 10 years. And I'd like to keep pushing that envelope a little bit. So in October, I hope many of you in this room are familiar with Paul Hawkins' project Drawdown. That really looked internationally and identified 100 existing feasible methods that could be used to address global warming and climate change. And so we sort of took that idea, and I think that we're the first community that is making an effort to apply some of the principles and some of the strategies and tactics from Project Drawdown in a way that's locally meaningful. And so we launched Drawdown Marin in October, and it really has sort of 6 different sectors that we're focusing on. The first being getting to 100% renewable energy as quickly as we can. Also, we're focusing on low carbon transportation, energy efficiency, buildings and infrastructure, local food and food waste, carbon sequestration, and resilient communities. And the goal here is to really move in each of those sectors towards a fossil-free community as quickly as we can. And we're looking at kind of the reverse engineering approach that one of our earlier panelists talked about. On if we want to get to a fossil-free community, how fast can we get there, and what do we need to do in the short term, in the next year, in the next 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, if we take that as our ultimate target. So there's a couple of key components to this to really making it a success from my perspective. One is putting together technical working groups in each of those 6 areas who will help us create that roadmap. What do we need to do? How fast can we do it? Or what are some of the impediments to being able to make change happen fast that we should be focusing on? And how do we move forward in an expeditious manner? The other key aspect of it, of course, is the public aspect. It's the grassroots aspect, because this is really a mobilization of effort if we're truly going to create a fossil fuel community. And so we have tremendous grassroots organizations in Marin County. One of our good community organizers is sitting at the back table, Sarah Loughran, who was really instrumental in an initiative reaching our goal of having every public agency, city, town, and county in Marin County 100% renewable. We hit that goal in the fall, and it was because of activities by community organizers like Sarah. And so it's going to take that kind of a grassroots mobilization as well, and getting everybody involved to be able to truly move us forward. But I'm excited about this. A lot of this is how to get people's attention. I think so often, at least in Marin County, we have a very strong environmental legacy. We have a lot of folks, we're proud of our achievements, we're proud of our accomplishments, we think we're fantastic environmentalists. We don't pay attention to the extraordinary greenhouse gas emissions from our buildings and our transportation. And we have a hard time accepting the kind of behavioral change that it will take from all of us to truly move the dial. And a lot of us are busy with our lives. It's hard to get people's attention. We find ourselves talking to the same group of committed environmental activists in all these wonderful programs that we put on. We're making some progress, I think, in getting more engagement with the business sector. But so the challenge for me, and I love the Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers, I'm thinking maybe that's going to resonate with some people who haven't been paying attention to 100% renewable and energy efficiency issues, is how do you capture people's attention? And I think, educating people, making them aware of how fast we really need to be taking action, given how fast climate change is happening these days. But I also, I recently sort of decided that my motto was going to be big think, actual impact. That it's important to move forward on a couple of different levels. One of them is the really innovative, challenging, creative ideas that I know many of you in this room think about. It's biomimicry. How do we really have something extraordinary that will capture the attention of people who are not paying so much attention? But that has to be coupled with real on-the-ground demonstration projects of success, so people can see, aha, I can do that, and I can move the dial. And so that's where my mind works. I'm trying to sort of straddle those 2 levels. And make sure that we have, I work a lot on the sea level rise side of the adaptation world, as well as the climate action plan, and trying to get us down to zero fossil fuels. I think in both of those sides of the climate change equation, we need to have really good on-the-ground demonstrable measures of success that we can show people how they can help us move forward more quickly, and then the tantalizing big change.
So I think with just a few minutes to go, I think I'll open it up to the audience. I have a lot of backup questions if you don't have anything, but I bet you do. They're coming.
Hi, I'm asking this question both as a San Francisco resident and a sort of environmental policy person by career. It's great if San Francisco and Marin do 100% renewable energy, but if we don't build more housing in those cities, then we're just pushing more development out to sprawl. Wanted to see if you had any comments on that.
I think San Francisco's doing a pretty good job of our share of it. So Marin.
So yes, let me talk as the, yes, thanks a lot. We used to hire her in Marin, and you can see why we let her go to San Francisco. Just kidding. I'm going to answer this as the poster child county for just say no to affordable housing, right? We have significant challenges in Marin County, and part of it is the result of all the great environmental progress that we made in the 60s and 70s. You know, 84% of Marin County is agricultural land and open space. That leaves us a pretty narrow band along Highway 101 where everyone needs to live. And we have a lot of folks who've lived there for a long time who have a hard time getting their mind around change. And so as a board of supervisors, we're kind of nibbling around the margins, frankly, in all honesty. And we've been focusing a lot on junior second units and second units. And in part, there's a couple of reasons for that that I think make that an appropriate approach in our community. We have a dramatically aging community, not that we're aging faster than anybody else, but there's a lot of us who are aging together. We have a lot of people who are house rich and cash poor, creating a lot of opportunities to create additional housing in existing buildings without adding a lot of new building infrastructure. So we're hoping that we can make some progress moving forward in that regard. We're also doing everything we can to maintain the affordable housing that we have. We bought the Coast Guard station out in West Marin, and that we're turning that into affordable housing. We bought trailer parks. We bought small apartment buildings in Stinson Beach. As a county, we're trying to acquire and maintain affordable housing in every way we can. Obviously, that's not enough. And you know, we complain a lot about traffic. Anyone who's ever tried to drive north on 101 after 3:30 p.m., don't do it. You won't be able to get anywhere. We have people who are tremendously aware of the traffic problems and very resistant to the notion that if we did have more housing, and if the over 60% of our workforce in Marin that drives into the county to work wasn't doing that and could live here, it would be a better world for all of us. So I think it's becoming a better conversation than I'd say it was 3 or 4 years ago. We have tremendous help from our businesses because it's such an employer problem. As a county, we've lost a lot of employees recently because they're simply tired of the commute. And the more we have that support from our employers about we have to expand our workforce housing, I think it's going to help the cause. But I'm not underestimating the challenge. And I will say, as much as I love Scott Weiner, I used to sit next to him on the Golden Gate Bridge District Board, a lot of legislation from the state legislation that thinks they'll solve the problem by coming in and telling local jurisdictions what to do exacerbates the hostility. So it's very tricky to figure out how to move forward in a productive way and try to damp down some of the resistance. But I feel like we're making some incremental progress.
We have time for one more. 1 minute. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'd like to get deeper in the question of the social consequences of electric cars, because it's not just to train mechanics for electric. The problem is the ratio of need is not 1-to-1, because electric cars demand much less mechanical work than normal cars. And then there's the question also of the parts industry. So this is a complicated problem. It's completely different from solar versus coal, because solar versus coal, you have a net progress in creating jobs. But in the question of electric cars, there's really a challenge. And I haven't read, the question is if there are any studies that show us how to deal with this problem.
So I have one solution from a little bit of a different perspective that I focus on environmental justice communities, and so how are you going to come to an environmental justice community and tell them, go and buy a $30,000 EV. One program that was developed is the Charge Ahead program, which a lot of people in the room know about, but particularly for environmental justice communities that can't afford an electric vehicle. The Charge Ahead program is a really great start at that, where you can get some incentives to trade in your old clunker for an affordable EV. There's also an issue around charging stations. And so somebody had talked about charging stations in an earlier panel, and the increase in charging stations around the state. We want to see a lot more charging stations in disadvantaged communities, and there's a part in that policy of the Charge Ahead program, and I think we're going to see this more and more, to bring in more charging stations in communities that actually want to go EV but can't.
And I would just say to your question about difference in maintenance needs, I think Jeff Simers was saying that, and I know we're seeing this in San Francisco too, that dealers don't really want to promote electric vehicles because their business model is in their service sector. So what you're talking about is a future shift in labor is already manifesting itself from the dealer side of whether or not they want to promote cars. So I think you bring up a great point.
Yeah, and just in closing, I think that actually brings up a great point, because it's an example of the challenges that integrating a complex system are going to bring us, right? So that one, we can kind of predict that, right? And we can think about it and we can plan for it. And I think that you guys can jump on me if I'm going too far afield here. But I think that part of working with communities is being able and making sure that your communities are resilient to change as we start to go through this and start to adopt these technologies, is getting ready not just for the known challenges that we know are coming, but also being able to react to the ones that, because it's such a complex system, we can't see yet. We do a lot of data work at NREL. We layer different data sets. We try to project what those changes are going to be. And a lot of what we are doing now is looking at how can we adjust for the margin where we don't know what is going to happen, and how can we have communities help contribute to their own strength in that way.
And just to add on there, there's interesting issues that come up unexpectedly. People for a long time focused on range anxiety for electric vehicles. With the fires in the North Bay this past fall, one of the things that people are now saying, well, how can I rely on an electric vehicle if there's that kind of firestorm and I haven't charged my car and I won't be able to evacuate? And so there's all different kinds of anxieties, even in addition to the change in the workforce issue, that sort of the unexpected challenges of trying to make that behavior change and get people more comfortable with a new kind of product.
Yeah, and speaking of change, I'd like to put in a plug from one all-women panel to another, that tomorrow morning they're talking about women in the transition in the mid-morning. So please join for that.